My very special pleasure and privilege to be able to moderate this session today, and especially to welcome our wonderful speakers for today's session. And I would like to start with Dr. Fruzsina Molnár-Gábor. She's a legal scholar who works at the Heidelberg Academy of Sciences in Germany. And her research focuses at the interface of health and medical law, data protection law. And she has a lot of experience also with legal frameworks like the GDPR. So it's very good to have you here, Fruzsina, for the legal issues. I would also like to welcome Dr. Stephen Rainey from the Hero Center for Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford. Dr. Rainey is a philosopher with a special focus on biomedical ethics and especially also neuroethics. He has also written about brain data governance in relation to GDPR and questions of neurorights more broadly. And very special pleasure also to welcome Samir from Montreal Neurological Institute, where he is a technological expert in the curation and analysis of neuroimaging data, has a lot of experience in the space of neuroimaging research, and knows and can guide us through the intricacies of making these data available for research, facing interoperability problems and other issues in the technological space. And it should also be mentioned that Samir is also active in the INCF, the International Neuroinformatics group that is also very active in the area of open science, open research. And so we're very happy to have you here with us. And we would also kick off this webinar with your input, Samir, to tell us a little bit about your work with neurodata.
Yeah, sure. So basically, maybe the slide could come on with that I have prepared. But in a nutshell, I should maybe make a statement. I'm actually not a neuroethicist, or I'm not part of any ethics board. I'm not a lawyer. I'm actually nothing in this field in a way. But what I do have is the war scars to prove that when we're trying to release data and create technologies around this, there are so many details on the ground that are very important. So this has been the last 20 years of my life, one way or another. You know, I've had phases of dealing with, say, HIPAA, you know, all the little details in terms of how to get those proper regulations implemented in terms of the technologies, and all kinds of other, you know, very fun parts of sharing data, essentially. So what I have here is a quick slide just to illustrate the kind of the challenges and the solutions very quickly that I've come across over the many years in terms of, you know, multi-center longitudinal studies, things that, you know, cross borders and really require, you know, the end product so that people can do processing and analysis and share this with their collaborators. So first and foremost, you know, there's obviously privacy issues and regulations. They differ by country. They are very important. Everything that we do, we consider privacy as the most important thing in terms of technical design or anything else that we're doing that's collaborative. But there are, you know, some problems that come up with that, because a lot of times ethics boards don't fully understand, you know, some of the regulations, because the field is changing dynamically. We've gone to a very web-oriented world in terms of sharing data. So, you know, research community sometimes has trouble keeping up in terms of all the changing technologies. So there's that. There's obviously security issues. We don't want to, you know, compromise if we have, you know, elaborate hashing functions that, you know, store some data in some ways for certain levels of openness. We don't want to have that compromise. So there's a world of computer science and cryptography that's associated with that. There's also building technical infrastructure that is usable and understandable by everyone. And the links between them. Standardization and interoperability are absolutely key in terms of being able to provide people with effective tools. It doesn't matter if you and your best friends understand one tool, but then you can't share with the rest of the world. So as you go down, there's all sorts of these kinds of challenges. And what I've spent a very long period of time doing is trying to come up with solutions for each of them. So the solutions, on the solution side, there are some things that are pretty straightforward. So privacy by design, if you already have a system that is less exposed in terms of private, patient data and things like that, then you're better off. There's less chance of errors and mistakes. But even then, there are things that we do very specifically, like, for example, with MRI scans, we actually do defacing of those scans in addition to, removing all kinds of other personal information. So, there's all those kind of type of, technological and governance issues that come into play. There's best practices in sharing. We've published papers like the COBIDAS paper for human brain mapping, where it basically it gives you a recipe for how to do proper data sharing. There are all sorts of tips and tricks. We can get into that later. Building software, obviously, that's efficient. Exposing the right kind of metadata, that's very important as well. We can touch upon any of these issues, but one of the most important things that we find is that that at least my experience is that if we can provide ethics boards with an ethics framework, or an ethics framework for the country that you're in, that already helps a lot, because that gives precedence to the ethics boards to understand, that there's somebody that's actually tackled this. And it also delineates all of the different details. So, in our work in recent times, for example, for the Canadian Open Neuroscience platform, Barth and Knoppers leads the ethical side of this, and they have produced an actual ethics framework on how you can share data. Obviously, that, is focused on Canada, but could easily be adapted and used in other countries. And so Stephanie Dyke, for example, has created a paper called a paper about registered access, which is a kind of a new way of sharing data that's still not, completely open to the world, but not entirely controlled or closed in that sense. So, that kind of thing could be very valuable. That's usually the first step when you're trying to share data. And so, obviously this all requires training, and something like an organization like INCF does a very good job of showing you what kind of standards exist and helping you with the training. So, one of the solutions is utilizing all of the things that groups like INCF have for you in terms of their resourcing and documentation and all of that kind of stuff. So this is a very short, simple outline of what are some of the challenges and solutions. Over the next little while in the discussions, I think we will come up with some very specific discussions and arguments over specific issues like GDPR and HIPAA and so on and so forth. But with that, I'll leave that there for now and defer to my colleagues for the rest of the presentation.
Thank you so much for getting us started, Samir. I think it's a really brilliant way of structuring also the different levels of what we're talking about here. So from the perspective of philosophy, neuroethics, biomedical ethics, Stephen, how did you get interested in this topic of brain data, neurorights? What do you think are the most pressing challenges there?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. I currently work in a European-funded project called BrainCom that's developing a neuroprosthetic device to provide communication abilities for patients with severe speech disabilities or even locked-in syndrome. And part of that project, aside from developing the rehabilitative device itself, is producing novel types of ECOG brain recording grids, exploiting things like 2D materials. And these will make very dense brain-conforming sensor arrays. Because these kinds of sensors allow high-density recordings of brain signals, I've been thinking about what kinds of implications there may be for brain data. So the more recording fidelity and density will allow more and possibly new types of brain signal processing. And turning brain signals into control data for devices, that is already very familiar. But with more and more data populating growing data sets, There's a promise of maybe novel insights into brain activity itself, better device control, and perhaps greater scope for applications beyond the lab, maybe in clinical settings, in psychiatry, for instance, in industry for making processes more streamlined, but also in the consumer marketplace. So I'm interested in how neurodata ethics specifically could help shape the evolution of neurotechnologies and neurointerventions. This begins in analyzing concepts of brain recording and datafication. And that draws upon fundamental neuroscience research, issues in technology development, and also policy matters like data governance, because those are the sorts of constraints and they'll create the constraints and opportunities for exploiting brain data as the technology progresses. And good old-fashioned philosophy, that's of course, let's not forget that. So some of the examples I'm interested in are instances of brain datafication that suggest that exploratory data science and analysis can provide hypotheses about how brains function. So just by collecting huge amounts of data and then using techniques like compressive big data analytics, it's possible to just analyze data sets directly and come up with hypotheses and clues about how the brain works. That's kind of an inversion of how we usually think of science. And because that data can be processed and maybe reprocessed, it makes it sensitive, I think, because data that's recorded for one purpose could in principle be reprocessed later on for another purpose, another intentional purpose, or it could just be automatically processed by algorithms and produce insights that weren't ever thought of. So that's a kind of factor that means protecting brain data is highly important. In it, there may always be latent and undiscovered meanings and potentials for meanings. So when it's used in applications like brain-computer interfaces, the data becomes part of the device personalization as well. So when it relates to a person, it becomes personal data. So if your data is personalizing your BCI device, then it's personal data. If that's implicated in a widespread consumer context, like the sort of consumer headsets that you can buy, we can imagine that brain data that's collected en masse from users comes to constitute part of the firmware or the operating system for that BCI device and for those BCI devices in general. So then it becomes really difficult to account for the individual personal data whenever you think about that massive system. You can't get the flour back after you've baked the bread. So it seems like the individual data, once it's merged into this large database and put to use, it might not be recoverable. But the right to personal data retrieval and maybe deletion is part of the GDPR. So it might be that consumer BCIs and technology like that exploit brain data impede citizens from exercising their rights. And that would be, that's just one example, right, of where brain data raises these kinds of interesting questions. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about that as we go on today.
Thanks so much, Stephen, for telling us a little bit about the ethical background and how it actually bleeds into also the legal aspects and is in some ways perhaps very tightly connected or inseparable from these questions. So, Fruzsina, from your perspective as a legal scholar, where are we at in terms of legislation that pertains to the use and access of brain data? Where are possible gaps in current frameworks, and what are the most pressing challenges from your perspective?
Thank you very much, Philipp, and also Samir and Stephen. So I'm a privacy scholar and a lawyer into data protection law and medical law, leading a research group. And with this background, basically related to brain data, I am very much interested in why brain data is different than any other personal data, and under what circumstances it is within the scope of application of privacy and data protection laws. The specificity of different kind of data, even if we consider them personal, I think should be leading somewhat the specific regulation that does relate to this kind of data. And currently, we only have, for instance, in Europe, a rather generalized regulation in the form of the GDPR and nothing more. And I think this is a crucial point where thinking about brain data from the privacy perspective should be starting. traditionally, we have an individual rights based approach to regulating data and privacy issues. And when thinking about brain data, we need to recognize that the certain kind of control perspective of the individuals in accessing the data and deciding about its use is blocked, because on a conscious level, you're not always able to reflect this kind of data that exists and what happens to it. So basically, intrusions on privacy related to this data are going to be, in certain circumstances, much more severe than other privacy-related issues around other personal data. And I think this thesis even holds in comparison with genetic data. Once you are actually basically losing this rights-based approach to dealing with your data, or the other individual subjective rights that are not on a human or fundamental rights level, but simpler rights such as access, delation, correction, right to be forgotten, they are also all affected because they are related to this very control perspective that you are knowing what happens with your data. It's the big question of anonymization that Stephen has just mentioned, where we have different approaches when we are at all talking about anonymized data. We have the absolute and the relative approach, and basically this contextualized understanding of privacy, I think, is very important, but it makes the regulation much more difficult, because you cannot go with an abstract generalized regulation, but you need to be aware of changing circumstances while working with this data. I think we will be elaborating today more about data protection principles and why they are challenged when we are introducing big data and neuro data and brain data. If you think about data minimization or the purpose principle, Stephen mentioned those. They are the basic groundings for privacy, and they are severely challenged, foremost with AI applications. And also the fact that data protection and privacy are not absolute rights. So we need to balance them against other rights, such as the research freedom, such as also interest in using data for commercial purposes. But the question is how to do this. And I would really like to emphasize in our discussion later, maybe more, that data security should be an understanding of balancing these different rights and interests, because you will be eager to bring both contradicting rights if you are in a balancing legal position to the most of them. So they should be all enforced the best way it's possible. And data security is actually the result of this balancing exercise. How can you allow to work with data, and how can you parallelly protect the privacy of those affected? And I think this should be a crucial perspective on also interactions between law and technology. On the international level, we need to discuss and think about how to regulate in a common sense. And this relates also to this balancing exercise, which basically every country, according to their constitutional traditions and regulatory approaches, will be deciding for their own. So how to bring this together into a common governance framework, and whether human rights would be helpful, an approach, regulatory approach based on human rights, to provide more standardization on the international level as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we now have developed a full canvas of challenges and possible issues that we could talk about. But I would like to go back to the beginning to tease out a little bit more the specific challenges at the sort of data processing level, the technical level, Samir, because in your structure that you introduced, one can see that there are very different levels to data protection. There's the technical level where you said, okay, we need maybe innovative solutions, look at metadata, maybe also things like federated learning, differential privacy, so soft and hardware-based ways for making data collection, data storage, and data transfer more secure. So it's the technical level, but there's also sort of the research culture level that often you have different communities who are doing research with and on neurodata and neuroimaging community, the biomedical community, clinical data, but increasingly, as Stephen also pointed out, the consumer domain. And obviously, we would want to have, we perhaps need very different approaches at the technical level, but also in the terms, in the ways in which we curate and make these data accessible to different audiences and different stakeholders. So what is for you the most difficult issue to address? Is it more sort of the technical side of informational security and privacy, or is it sort of this collision between different interests from different communities who want to get access to these data?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different components, as I was outlining before, and from my perspective, the technical stuff is fairly straightforward in terms of coming up with some kind of implementation, coming up with one that everyone agrees upon, that all the different kind of worlds, the disciplines, or it's very multidisciplinary these days, come together and also agree, having ethics boards understand and kind of relate to what is being done. Those are the challenges. So it's a lot of it's communication and governance. Having a proper ethics framework already helps, something that's very detailed. I mentioned that before. Obviously things like open standards or open APIs, open interoperability, that already helps a lot because it gets through some of the technical problems from one system to talk to another, right? So proprietary systems are really good within a certain sphere, but outside of that, it has trouble communicating. I would say a couple of other little tidbits. So ethics boards could probably benefit from having a technical resource, some person that's really well versed in the changing technologies. That is something that we often find is, especially as we're embarking on new kinds of technologies for sharing and interoperability, there's often a lag between, an ethics board understanding exactly what is being done. They may have scientific representation, but they don't necessarily have technical. And so an education, even for the whole community at large, about what is open science. I mean, I still have people coming up to me and defining open science as literally closed science. So, making sure that everyone understands what that means and what the goals are, right? I mean, the ultimate goal is to accelerate scientific discovery. And there are things that are pushing us to have to share or to have larger sample sizes, not least of which is things like AI. So those are all good as long as they're done in a way that is responsible and adheres to, privacy considerations and all the ethical and consent kind of details. So it's about bringing this all together, organizing, I think. And that is, I think, the biggest challenge we have.
Thanks so much, Samir. From the perspective of individual rights that Fruzsina mentioned, this is also obviously from a normative perspective very closely connected to individualistic or considerations, ethical considerations of the individual, Stephen. And of course, autonomy plays an important role there. We increasingly hear talk or read about data subjects, humans as data subjects, and obviously how informed consent models could play an important role in mediating access for different purposes, for using brain data for different purposes. And this might become especially salient in the consumer domain. Do you think that current approaches to informed consent are flexible enough or good enough to deal with the sort of required granularity in terms of moderating access to these data, or do we need innovative approaches to to consent models for brain data use, especially in the consumer domain?
Yeah, especially for consumer. There's quite a puzzle really, because the sort of neural-based devices operate through the extraction of brain signals from neural data that may be produced involuntarily. They will be difficult to individuate because of the recording techniques involved and maybe processed by AI. So depending on what kind of signal is required, different data might be extracted from one set of neural recordings, as suggested before. So the recording, I feel like, is general, but the processing is purpose relative, but also quite malleable because it can be reprocessed. So exactly how you can consent to the brain recording in the first instance is a bit tricky, because what are you being asked to consent to? The recording itself, which is general and could be repurposed, is it the specific processing, which again could vary and be reused later? And if you said maybe broad consent, like is used in biobanking, might be a good model for consent in that, well, that does rely a lot on expert opinions taken, decisions taken further down the line. Whereas an alternative model might be dynamic consent, but then that might be quite onerous. And if someone's going to be consented every time some sort of process was happening, especially if you think of that sort of like a cloud-based approach to brain data that might occur with a lot of BCI stuff, there would be constant processing and algorithmic processing going on. So what would we have to continually say yes to processing what you didn't really understand? And that ultimately would impact on the informedness of the consent anyway. So yeah, it's really tricky to think about how that happens, how that could happen. If you want to have a really good functional brain recording device that can do really interesting things with all the data it's collected, consent becomes really tricky to understand.
Yeah, I think it's a big challenge. Also in terms of the legal provisions that you then need to protect the privacy of the individuals. And so, Fruzsina, in the area of governance, also legislation, we see a lot of, and also legal and neuroethical scholarship, we see a lot of developments now in the space of what is called neurorights. So the idea that certain types of neurotechnologies and ways in which we process brain data might give insight into brain processes and mental processes in a way that might invade a person's mental privacy, the privileged domain of their thoughts, emotions, and other mental processes that are usually hidden from the outside world, but also in devices that might actively interfere with the brain, have consequences for mental integrity, so the unified experience that we have. And so the question would, and we have seen now legislative efforts, successful efforts in Chile. Spain is bringing neuroprotection legislation underway. But you've talked a little bit also about the international level. So what do you think would be an approach that is both specific enough for certain legal contexts, like national legislations or regional aspects, but also enables a way to productively use data for research, or, for example, sharing data between different legislations. So how can we find the right balance also between individual rights and individual interests and maybe collective interests in terms of biomedical research? What are promising legal approaches in your view?
Yeah, thank you very much. I will try to connect my answer with that previously heard from Samir and Stephen, because it's getting really interesting. So one on the note on technical people on ethics boards reminds me of the challenge how to provide regulation that really respects different disciplinary insights. And I think this is really important and a crucial point. And I think that there are regulatory methods that are also somehow realizing this kind of perspective. Even the GDPR has a regulatory instrument, codes of conduct, which can be proposed by interdisciplinary panels, gatherings of different scientists. This is really a very loose definition, where you can actually work in interdisciplinary manner on main rules involving ethics and technology and legal people. to provide sector-specific rules for a certain area. And I do think that brain data governance would very much benefit from such instruments on every level that are really, from the very starting point, developed in an interdisciplinary and open manner, where you can, with the specifying rules of data protection, already provide for respecting different kinds of interests, research interests and privacy interests, and try to make rules where these are balanced. So the first point would be really such new and maybe somehow innovative regulations, not just the traditional legislator putting down very general rules that then in the course of the application need to be specialized, and which is really a challenge for researchers then, and where probably authorities will be more blocking research because they would really like to provide for the privacy, which is understandable, but where actually the expertise for these balancing exercises are missing. The second point relates a bit to one of Stephen's points on the informed consent and how to really still provide that the data subject is in the mid of all the happenings and still is aware of what's happening and the privacy rights are protected. And I do share the thoughts about the challenges for informed consent, even that there are developments towards broad consent or dynamic consent, which might be a solution or might less be a solution. I do think dynamic consent models are promising. You can, always think about building in options to receive less information and to emphasize the right not to know of the data subject, if they so wish. However, there is an additional approach to informed consent, and that is its management, where legal perspectives are now open about discussing data trustees that could be set up in different kind of manner. And data trustee is not really defined in a closed manner. So in every discussion, we have different kind of definitions. But one approach to these data trustees would be that they overtake the consent management for certain groups of patients, which would firstly provide that there are stratified approaches that are built for affected groups when their data is handled. Second, I think there is no law saying that you really have to enforce and implement your right to self-determination on your own. So you can always rely on someone communicating this, and probably it's more effective if it's in a bundled way. Third, you really can avoid information overload for those affected. Fourth is the challenge, of course, because all the provisions that relate to consent, for instance, in the GDPR, need also to be applied in this relationship between a data trustee and the data subject. So there is actually the challenging question whether all the different kind of problems around informed consent, particularly for brain data processing, are just really then reflected on another level with different actors involved, but they are not really solved. But I do think that it's an approach that needs further discussion and that really has benefits.
Yeah.
The third one relates to processing and reprocessing and how transparency rules could help there to provide more insight to those affected and give information. I think we don't really have any standardized approach to what does transparency mean when data processing happens. So I do think that's an issue needing more thinking. The GDPR provides, for instance, different kind of regulations where you have a fiction that continuing scientific research with the data is always compatible with the previous purpose, but you need to apply all those principles that are generally applicable for data protection. And the most important will be, in this context, transparency, because you need to inform those affected. Fourth, internationally, I really think that it's more an interoperability problem. I would like to talk about interoperability, not just in a technical sense, in communicating between different information systems, but in a legal sense. I've mentioned in the small introduction that I do understand data security as a result of a balancing act of different rights and interests. And I do think that this could result in different legal systems and different security measures. So technical and legal interoperability are really connected. If we have legal differences in the understanding and the approach, this might be reflected then on a technical level, and actually in a very practical level would lead to information systems not being able to entirely communicate with each other to exchange data in the interest of research. And this would also lead, of course, to a certain kind of, danger for the whole data security system for unauthorized accesses or for usages that are not legitimized or have no real legal basis. So I do think we have here a task to think about legal regulation in the sense that it should be reflected with the technology to provide authorized use in the interest of research, but also to avoid unauthorized use and those that are not legitimate in the sense of what is the will of the data subject.
Thank you very much. I think this is super helpful, this idea of interoperability at different levels of consideration. Samir, I would think that the question of consent is also extremely important for people who handle neurodata on an everyday basis. I know it myself, like I'm a neurologist, neuroscientist, so I have always have this question of obtaining consent, making sure that the expectations are addressed correctly. Do you see a way forward for technology to help in that space? For example, I think Fruzsina alluded to this a little bit, the idea of data fiduciaries, so data banks, for example, neutral entities that could handle your personal biomedical data in a way that banks now handle our financial data, one aspect. And the other aspect for e-consent models, many people say dynamic granular consent is too complicated for consumers and for patients because it's often very difficult to understand. But I think if it is led by the question of what purpose the data is used for, it's actually quite easy to understand for data subjects, for individuals. So they can consent to say, I want my data to be used for medical research or biomedical research, but I do not want it to be used for consumer research, for example, or for marketing. So if you find a way to connect the purpose that a data subject might be willing to consent to flexible ways to handle this technologically and make it safe and secure, I think could be a great match.
So yeah, absolutely. We're already doing that, actually. So a couple of key points. One is at the Montreal Neurological Institute, we're the first clinical research unit to go open, right, in that sense. And the attrition rate for the number of people who have, consented to open science, to fully sharing their data is very low, 1% to 2%. I forgot the exact decimal point there. So 98% plus people have consented to this. Now, obviously, technology can play a role in making this easier, right? So we're also working on things like e-consent. We're adapting some of the tools from the Sage BioNetworks repertoire of all these things they've done. And we're turning that into concrete web-based forms that allow you to do things like more granular consents. So there's all sorts of consent codes. I think we have a publication coming out about that shortly, where you can have it very granular, but it doesn't have to be so hard. It can be easier through very nice descriptive documentation on the web and nice workflows that allow you to do that. So that's something that we're also doing. And I agree, it is quite complicated in terms of international borders and legislations. We're an aggregation of international data. So, a rule in one country may not, be the same as a rule in others. I have my own personal opinion on how you can solve some of these issues. So things like GDPR and HIPAA and stuff they're general broad stroke kind of regulations to protect people. But they're not, I think they were targeted in certain ways for certain purposes. Like I know there's been a lot of target on these large multinational corporations that maybe are using your data without your knowledge in a more deceptive way. But researchers, use data for a very different purpose in most cases, right? So we're trying to accelerate science. So maybe we could, instead of only focusing on that, we could also have regulations to make sure that people don't use your data in a wrong way, right? So if I give my data to the whole world and an insurance company wants to use that in some kind of way that might hurt me, maybe the regulations can be there as well, right? So to protect myself in that sense. So there's all kinds of stuff that comes into play here, but there's only an hour today, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Boy, that was weird watching oneself. We deliberately also put on different outfits to make it even more confusing. And we are waiting for a couple of questions from the audience. In the meantime, perhaps we can entertain the audience perhaps by getting back to what we were talking about and maybe reflect a little bit, a little distance from the first event. So, Stephen, what were some of the points from the discussion that you thought would merit a sort of deeper conversation or follow-up consideration?
Well, we never made it to neurorights in detail, and given that's such a story in the news at the moment, I was not surprised really, because we were going into detail about the topic itself, but I think the broader umbrella of neurorights was something I thought we'd end up talking about, but we sort of talked about the material of that instead.
Mm-hmm. Fruzsina, for you, what were some of the takeaways or things that you thought could be expanded in the discussion now?
Yeah, I thought we should be really more elaborating on the consent issue, which we actually did consider quite intensively, but there probably still needs to weigh certain consent solutions against the backdrop of the specificity of brain data, and also the relationship between technical and legal interoperability that is surrounded by questions where I think that a practicable and also from the legal standards well-founded solutions could emerge.
Excellent. And Samir, with little hindsight, what were some of the topics that you thought we could discuss here a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's so many areas we could do a deep dive into each of them, but I think the biggest issue is to get some ethics frameworks and legislation that is very specific to research data, right? That seems to be the one thing that, whether it's government regulations on a country level or even, institutional levels, like right now, GDPR potentially will fine you $20 million if you don't do things correctly. And that might not be a big deal for Facebook, but for a research institution that's just trying to, further research, they don't even want to go there. They don't even want to think about it. So right then and there, something is lost. So I think we should find ways to deal with that a little bit as well.
Yeah. Would be a shame though, because with the 20 million, Facebook could sponsor 5 ethics of neuroscience chairs. But anyway, so I think these are all excellent questions. Maybe we start, because it's a little more on the conceptual side, with the point, the issue of neurorights, because as you say, Stephen, this is something that is very much in the news, and if I may, I will sort of give some context for the audience. So neurorights is basically the idea that with the advent of brain mapping technologies, not only for clinical applications, but also in the consumer domain, there are rising concerns about the way in which certain approaches might give access to mental information, to mental states, to a level of subjective experience that has hitherto been sort of hidden from direct access. Of course, we have the ability to access other people's minds by asking them questions, by looking at things that they produce, by looking at their behavior, their verbal outputs, and so forth. But I think it's fair to say that everyone still has this idea that there's a privileged level of first-person subjective experience that is not directly accessible if we do not have corresponding behavioral output. And of course, a lot of neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, is precisely preoccupied with elucidating this area through various neuroimaging methods, fMRI, FNIRS, e.g. brain-computer interfaces hinge on the idea that you can use decoding of brain activity for operating external factors and so forth. So it's a big issue for neuroscience and neurotechnology, obviously. But there are also growing concerns in the ethics community, in the legal community, whether certain types of emerging technologies may give rise to the need for certain neuroprotection laws or regulations. And generally, you can distinguish the level of mental privacy, so the privacy of your thoughts, your inner mental states, the question of mental integrity, so the integrity and unity of your subjective experience. This relates more to techniques from neuromodulation, electrical brain stimulation, and so forth. And then there's the whole area of cognitive liberty, which is somewhat related to freedom of thought. And all these concerns have given rise to now growing literature on these so-called neurorights. And on the conceptual side, there's also criticism. People say, well, this is a little bit neurocentric. It's not only about the brain, but human existence has more dimensions. It includes the rest of our body. It includes social relations. But on the other hand, people say, well, brain data may well be the closest correlate that we will have to these very privileged private mental states. And so we better make sure to have a anticipatory and proactive way of governing access to this realm. And this is the whole debate about neurorights. And it hinges in many ways, it hinges on our understanding of how specific brain data really are and whether they, at the moment or in the future, may really give us more access to mental states than we would otherwise gain. So there's a lot of need for discussion in that respect. And it, of course, also relates to normative questions that are more discussed in the ethics space, questions like autonomy, questions like consent. And so maybe we can take these considerations into account when continuing the discussions. So, Stephen, you brought up the point about neurorights. What are some of the most important issues and challenges for you, looking at it from a philosophical and neuroethics angle?
Well, it's a real mine, I think, of interest in puzzles, even from the perspective of trying to figure out the relation of brain data to brains, brain activity to the mind, and then the legal concepts that are in play as well. So whether rights are even the correct way to think about it. So is there a corresponding duty for a right to mental freedom, for instance? That would suggest that the impetus for that would be that a neurotechnology shouldn't be able to affect your train of thought, for instance, or your ability to think thoughts that you would otherwise want to think. But if that was framed quite broadly in the sense that there was a duty to not interfere with someone's train of thought with technology, and there was a legal remedy for some kind of technology that did do that, framed too broadly, that would possibly rule out conversation, because conversation is an instance where sentences confront your train of thought and often try to change people's minds. So there's a question about whether, like, mental integrity or mental freedom or cognitive liberty are things that ought to be protected by, in terms of rights and duties, or in terms of legal privileges that ought to be protected by other things like social norms or conversational norms. So that's just from the legal side. And then, yeah, the representation idea about what data represents. Does the brain data represent the mind? What I'm interested in that particular thing is just the language, whether we talk about brain data as decoding the brain or brain data as representing the brain, I think say very different things. And that really interests me, because the decoding rhetoric sounds more like there is something there to be decoded, and that's somehow hidden by the fact of the brain and the science that we do or don't have, versus representation. Well, that raises interesting questions about why something's represented the way it is, how it's represented that way, how it might have been represented otherwise. And so just from those two angles, there's already loads of stuff from a research point of view, which is really interesting, the legal concepts and the mental concepts.
Yeah. Maybe before we turn to the more in-depth legal considerations with Fruzsina, I wanted to ask Samir on this question of the specificity of brain data, because on the one hand, of course, neuroscience is predicated on the idea that by inventing new tools to observe the brain and to improve our ways of analyzing data from these tools, we might glean more insights into basic processes, but also higher level cognitive processes in the brain. So the whole endeavor of neuroscience is basically predicated on this general motivation. And so what would you say is the current state of what we can glean from brain data? How specific are they in terms of how they correspond or represent the inner workings of the brain, and what will be possible in the near future? What is your feeling about that?
So there's there's a lot, right? I mean, there are group averages of the brain where you can, do some kind of group-wise analysis, and that's maybe good enough for certain kinds of analyses. In other situations, you need to see the actual individual brains themselves. So it's kind of a balancing act, but depends on what your analysis framework is, what you're trying to exactly do. But there are very much cases where, like, for example, I mentioned before, in terms of anonymizing, we actually deface some of the brains. But in certain cases, you actually need that face data. You need the morphological, the shapes of the face, because you're doing, say, I don't know, an autism study, and these features become kind of relevant. So, then defacing it sort of wipes out some of the information that you have. We have these kind of similar issues with like the header information, what header information is relevant that needs to be shared or not. And it's a very tough balancing act, because, at some point, I think we can all agree that you should have privacy and security constraints, right? That there should be some kind of protections in certain cases, for sure. I don't know too many people that are pure libertarians in the research field that say there's no regulations at all that are required. On the other hand, it is like very tricky to figure out what that line is. I mean, in your brain, your sulcal shape could actually be identifiable, to a specific individual, right? So, how do we anonymize that? There's no way that I'm aware of. Or you could forensically, maybe get different pieces of information that are anonymized and put that together statistically or in some way, and be able to identify someone. Not to mention, half of the people that are subjects have all their data all over the world in different platforms without even a care or consideration. So you could just ping that. So it's very tricky to decide, how to deal with this, but most definitely you can use like very specific individual features from a subject. So it's about from my perspective, I give out a lot of my data. I'm actually the most scanned human being on the face of the planet. And I want people to share that data, but I don't want that to be then used against me in some kind of malicious way. So as long as I understand the risks for me personally, that helps a lot, right? So then if I consent to things that are very clearly laid out, that goes a long way with me. And I think with a lot of people. But there's no right answer here exactly.
Yeah, but I would say it's an important point to say that specific anatomical features or neural signature in brain signals can become markers of group identities. So if you consider also intermittent temporal slowing in EEG data, which is an indicator of older age, you have certain biosignatures, certain neural signatures that might be indicative of certain other parameters. And so from a legal perspective, Fruzsina, we have the problem that we have a very complex landscape of fundamental rights, human rights, but also applied laws and regulations, consumer protection that address many of the concerns that are voiced in this neurorights debate, but they're not bundled together in a way that make them very actionable and usable for real life legal protection or cases. So what would a legal toolbox or legal framework look like that can leverage the already existing rights that we have for optimally protecting brains from undue interference and protecting the identity of research subjects, but at the same time enable open data science and sort of beneficial use of neurotechnology and neuroscience?
Yes, thank you. This is a very complex question, and I think you are very right when you say that there is a very severe fragmentation of relevant rules, both vertically and horizontally. And we are dealing here with multi-level systems, which means that in certain regions or countries, there are different set of rules, international law, public international law, EU law, for instance, national laws, of course, or even bigger regional rules, such as the privacy rules in Asia, which all are combined then when it comes to an application. And it's definitely difficult many times when you are having complex facts and cases to provide here actually effective enforcement and effective implementation as well. There are, of course, many tools that work quite well, and different kind of legal systems and levels where regulation is possible have all their disadvantages, but also advantages. If you look into public international law, you have a very strong framework of human rights, but of course the effective enforcement is sometimes a question, not just in the brain data context, but also in other contexts, where you have an interplay of what kind of regulatory tool you want to use to specify these human rights and to apply them for a certain sectoral question. It becomes more complex because treaty law is very strong and binding, but states will not really adhere to this, and it takes a long time to develop treaty instruments in international law, and they often remain on a very general level because state parties don't want to bind themselves. There is the possibility on international level to develop soft law, which means declarations and recommendations from international organizations that are supported by the member states, of course, and they are non-binding, but they really have a very strong factual binding force in that, of course, if the state parties agree that they want to develop such an instrument, that they will adhere to this and they will apply this instrument. However, legal bindingness is missing, and it functions in many ways similarly as binding law. You can make reservations to these instruments, etc. But they are often very nice because you can get more concrete. Those participating don't really have the impression we need to develop something binding, so we are fixed and nailed down. So they will adhere to more specific rules, which allows to really consider what are the real human rights implications for brain data and to make more sector-specific rules on this. And of course, such agreements, which are soft law, you can also use to help interpret binding law. So to draw them on and to say, okay, the general treaty law that we have that is defining the framework of human rights and fundamental rights is going to be interpreted in light of specific of these specific rules that are in themselves non-binding. We do have a new and quite specific privacy regulation on the international level, even if it's regional, but the Council of Europe has recently modernized its privacy convention. 2018, I think the original version was back 1981, so really out of date. But this instrument does not specifically respect brain data. It defines particular privacy rules to sensitive data, but the specificities are not regarded. And again, if we look into this instrument and how it generally works, we bump into those general problems that international law often has when it tries to develop something more specific and binding. It's a binding international treaty, but of course on a regional level, and it's open to non-member states. So the US and everyone could join, but the question is whether they really will or can, if it's not really well anchored and situated in their own national laws. So it's all these questions that are, of course, on the international level, somewhat making processes to make specific regulation for an area more severe. Yeah. I do think that there is a promising instrument, codes of conduct, which can be developed on different levels internationally and also on the EU level, which is an interdisciplinary approach. And we talked about this in a previous session, which might be promising, but of course, these general problems of bindingness and anchoring, they do remain.
Excellent. And so there seem to be pathways that one could take to implement these legal protections for brains and minds. But Stephen, everyone agrees that clinical use of brain data and developing new therapies and approaches for people who are afflicted with neurological psychiatric disorders is a valuable endeavor. And we need openness, we need transparency, and we need a lot of collaboration, also internationally, to make sure that this is in progress. But at the same time, we also see an emerging field of consumer neurotechnology that directly addresses individuals, consumers with often unvetted, unregulated devices for neurofeedback-based relaxation, often with a sort of paramedical ambition that conceals the fact that it's also targeting people's well-being and health, but comes across as sort of like a gamified, nice tool or toy for playing around with your brain activity and so forth. And so on the one hand, we have very tight regulations in the medical device space and medical software space, and very under-regulated, very big gray area of emerging consumer neurotechnology with powerful technology companies taking an active interest in this. We mentioned Facebook, but it's also other companies, obviously Neuralink, in terms of marketing stunts and visibility. They are also quite active in this. And then human rights only apply to states, if I'm not mistaken, and companies as such are not accountable to international public law, but they need to be regulated in other ways. So what would be an approach that you could see for effectively regulating this space of sort of proliferating, questionable consumer neurotechnology?
Well, I think there's at least two angles there. One is the very idea that one would be allowed to experiment with neurotechnology for oneself, sort of amateur neurohacking or something like that. And the questions there seem to be, they seem to draw upon the kinds of notions you see about free speech, that people talk about J.S. Mill and that sort of stuff, where you should be free to act to the extent that it doesn't impinge on someone else. So as long as my brain hacking is my own. The one question might be there is that, given the fact that you're exploring and sort of playing with your own brain, you don't really know what's going to happen. You could create issues that for other people that you could predict, even if that was just medical intervention, if you do something weird. In terms of the tech companies, I think it's different, because they have clear priorities, profit motives, and so on. So the questions there come down to the sorts of categories they use to analyze data, and the sort of intentions they have. So, for instance, if I buy a device that claims to be a relaxation tool, it'll tell me when my brain scan indicates stress, and it'll recommend I don't know, go for a walk. If that's also that's the stated purpose, but if beyond that the purpose is also just to scrape as much brain data as it can get to populate a massive cloud-based database that can then be processed and reprocessed to create insights that will ultimately benefit financially the company, then that would somehow need to be stated. And that, in a way, that isn't even an ethical problem. That's to do with sort of consumer transparency. If a device says it's one thing and it really or also does something else, then that should be on the box. That might also relate to consent, because you have to tick all the boxes for the the little leaflet you read about the device you've just bought. So if it isn't completely transparent that what you're getting out of this transaction is a device that tells you to go for a walk when you're stressed, and what we're getting is access to your brain data that we're going to amalgamate with all the other stuff, we're going to make loads of money out of it. Unless that's really obvious and made clear to the person buying, then I think that's an issue. So the regulation, maybe I don't want to advocate this, but maybe in the individual case, it's more like drugs, in the sense that you should have liberal drug policies that allow people to mess around with their own senses and that sort of thing. But it's also limited in the sense you're not allowed to drink and drive, you're not allowed to take various categories of drug. Maybe something like that model would fit neurohacking, because you can have similar effects. But with companies, I think there's a huge amount of transparency needed because of the profit motive in the market.
Samir, I know you can't speak for INCF, but my understanding is that INCF is a strong advocate for data sharing, for open science, because it's conducive to collaborative and collective research, and citizen scientists, people who want to explore their own brain out of curiosity, or maybe even because they want to use it to enhance their own well-being. Is that something that you're familiar with in your work? Are you connected to the sort of brain hacking and neurohacking, do-it-yourself neurotechnology community? Is that something that where more engagement is needed, or more conversation is needed, more communication is needed? Because I know a little bit about the open BCI community, and it's often a wonderful set of people who like build their own electrodes with 3D printers, very inventive, very creative endeavors. So there could also be a lot to learn about sort of bottom-up and sort of non-hierarchical forms of collaborative research from such collectives. So I think communication exchange is needed. So what is your stance on this versus sort of the kind of more organized, commodified, and clearly commercial consumer neurotechnology that Stephen was also talking about?
I mean, so my world, we're more on the collective side of things. Like what we do is we do different studies and we try to get ethics for those studies. So it's not about one individual, doing whatever they want for themselves, but those come up. I mean, like I mentioned, I am actually one of those individuals myself. I have been part of projects that say, put restrictions on what what the subjects can do with their brain data. But then I'm an individual and it's my data, right? So if I was like a project lead for that project, then I would have to make sure I respect the ethics for all the subjects in that project. But if I simultaneously it's my data, I also have the right to do whatever I want with it. And I'm not sure how that gets resolved between, the study itself, the ethics boards of the studies, and then my individual rights. So on that front, there's a lot of unknown there. As far as companies go, I mean, what we're trying to do is we're trying to partner with larger corporations and companies. In many cases, there are mandates now, funding mandates that say that universities have to get part of their funding from, one part private sector, one part from the university. And of course, those companies have a vested interest in if they're going to be paying for some of this stuff. So the M&I Open Science Initiative is no exception. There's partnerships with private industry, and I think they see the value in going open. So they themselves like put in a lot of money and work to collect data. So if they can suddenly have access to it, there's benefits, but they have to then adhere to all of the rules and regulations, especially the ethics frameworks that we have. So it's uncharted territory in a lot of ways, right? I think we're still kind of going through what is ethical, what is legal, what is technologically feasible, all those kinds of issues. And it's a field that's still just forming,
Fruzsina, from a multi-level governance perspective, self-regulation obviously may also play a role. Professional bodies that give themselves codes of conduct or rules, but also companies. And so from your perspective, what do you think could be the role of ethical self-regulation, if at all? What is its relationship to sort of forms of ethical whitewashing, virtue signaling on a large scale? Could ethical self-regulation by private stakeholders, private actors be conducive to the overall effort, or do you think it makes things more complicated or is not effective in terms of making things better?
Sorry, difficult questions. I see this in rather an ambivalent way. So I do see the benefits of ethical approaches, which I will shortly elaborate on, but I do also see the negative side, that it's actually a misuse of what ethics should be in some cases. And there is no real effective measure, I think, to hinder that yet. Where I do see benefits from an ethical approach is how it is actually anchored and complementing legal rules, which of course have their barriers related to many factors, because they are different in different states and regions, because enforcement probably lacks efficiency often, or because just that you are regulating in a very balanced way with competing fundamental rights, right to information, freedom of expression and data protection, but you can list many of those competing interests related to various actors involved in these processes. And probably just giving an example from the data protection perspective, there are many rules in data protection that, of course, provide for a relatively good protection depending on the exact legal system you are in if it comes to dealing with brain data. However, the scope of application is, of course, often limited from different perspectives, territorially or from the subject matter that they regulate. And I do really see a positive spillover of these rules into the ethical framework, or the other way around. I can't really decide where the real influence comes from. I don't think it's a one-way, but it's a mutual one. For instance, around the case of whether data are really anonymized. I mean, this will be decided in a context-related manner, whether you are able to come back to the persons affected based on different kinds of affected data, and then make intrusions on the right and interests. And as this anonymity and how you can deal with data is always decided relating to the context, which data, who is working with it, what is the purpose exactly, what you want to reach with it, how you are handling this. Actually, we are in the need to apply many of those data protection rules outside of the scope of application of the real law. I mean, you are dealing with, according to the law, anonymous data, but you want to uphold this status in order to be able to work with the data, to process it, and enable to protect individuals. So you will need data management systems, information management systems. You will still need to look at the purpose. Why am I using this data? So we really see a spillover effect into this extra legal territory of the rules that are really applying in data protection. And I'm really wondering many times whether some kind of ethical governance in its different forms could be useful here, to say that they are really complementing each other, and that is actually also leading conduct of dealing with this very sensitive data outside of the scope of the real regulation.
Similar concerns about data protection and protecting individuals arise in the area of genetic research, molecular biology. Obviously now with the advanced methods for gene editing, but it has a long tradition now, biobanking, genetic research. Do you think we can learn anything from the way that data are being used there? Because they seem to be also a special category of biological, biomedical data that have meaning that sort of transcend their immediate utility or their biochemical signature. They also have a lot of ethical, philosophical subtext, much in the same way that brain data may have in other ways. Do you think we can learn something in terms of, for example, how to biobank brain data, how to govern access to this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Basically, the short answer would be yes, because the level of sensitivity is comparable of these data, genetic data, compared to brain data. However, I do think that this sensitivity is manifested in a different level or in different ways. I mean, genetic data is basically and its usage out of the control of individuals, because the information you can derive from it is so complex. The analysis methods that you apply are so very related to expert insights and knowledge that there is really difficulties in providing enough information to individuals to be able to remain in control and enforce their rights. And I think this also applies to brain data, but actually the sensitivity is a different level one, as you will not many times be able to relate consciously to your brain data and how it is used. So actually the individual is even more out of this control position, which a human rights, individual rights perspective would probably promote. This is why I do think that we need to maybe benefit from other risk-based approaches, which are more about putting together informational principles, data protection principles, to coordinate conduct of those actors within that data and not leaving the individuals alone to be able to control, because there will be difficulties in giving them the tools to be able to. The biobanking community related to genetic data, I think, has a very long-standing tradition where time has allowed to develop really sound ethical and legal governance frameworks to deal with those data. And those are, I think, provisions and approaches which are absolutely of benefit also for brain data, such as the consent issue around broad and dynamic consent, which actually emerged from this whole context of biobanking and could be also very useful to a certain extent by regarding also the specificities for brain data.
So
maybe, Samir, I was gonna ask you maybe, about sort of the potential role for data fiduciaries like data banks, where people can give their brain data and where it will be safe housed and curated and only given away for specific purposes based on your consent, for example.
Funny, our brainwaves are aligned, because that was exactly what so we have our own open science initiatives, as I was mentioning, and so we have different levels of sharing for more sensitive information, like obviously, genetic information. We that's still under a controlled access kind of layer. So, we have very open data, entirely open. We have registered access, and we also have controlled access. Because, if you share genetic data, there are sort of companies these days that are, getting all your genetic information, telling you what your origins are, and then next thing you know, you find out you have a brother, or whatever, right? So there are these implications that could come about. In other cases, even deeper than that. And so, but what helps is that we have these sort of consent codes, essentially, where, we have specific consent for specific types of data, different levels of sharing, and that's all put in there together so that people who are signing on to our open science initiative, they know which kinds of data are going open, what their exact purpose is, how they'll be shared. All those pieces of information are included, right? So that's, I guess, like I was mentioning before, informed consent for me goes a long way. And so that's how it all ties into our biobanking infrastructure.
Yeah, so actually I think so there could be more crosstalk between these communities, the communities that are actively involved in curating and warehousing neurodata, and the sort of more conceptual research in legal and ethical domain. So I think this is a great occasion, or these two events were now a great occasion to exchange views, but maybe there could also be ways to make this a more permanent kind of a conversation or exchange, working group between neuroinformatics and neuroethics that examines these, neurolaw, obviously, also that examines these questions on a running basis. I can envision something like that too, because it's been very informative. So we're approaching the end of this session. So I wanted to ask whether any of you would have any final comments and remarks or things that could still be said on the kinds of things we talked about. Because otherwise, I would conclude the session. Yeah, Stephen, maybe.
Well, yeah, just on what you were saying about the continued conversation, there's an interesting sort of subtext in when we're talking about ethical and legal regulation is this sort of implicit notion of compliance, that you are or you aren't in compliance. And there are moments at which you ought to be in compliance when you're, for instance, when you come to ethical review, for instance, like that. And another way to think about it is something that came out of the experience of working in the Human Brain Project, where what we tried to do is have a more dialogical approach that involved the ethics. There was a meta responsibility approach. That's what we called it. And the idea was that you kind of checked in with researchers that went along and had discussions with the researchers to see that they were taking responsibility as they went along, and to suggest things that, from an outside perspective seemed ethically interesting or legally interesting. And that meant there were no shocks. There weren't points at which someone finds out they're not in compliance or where they find out there's a problem. Instead, there's a more dialogical approach. And I think that model can also be put up the levels into policy making as well. So if policymakers aren't confronted, for instance, with a new technology which suddenly causes concern, do we need to regulate for this? Do we need to regulate for that? If instead policymaking is involved in processes of technology development, then in a dialogical sense, then there's no moment where it becomes a shock and an urgent decision point. So that sort of ongoing conversation thing is I think the way to go.
Another important point from my side is to close off. I'll let Fruzsina have the last word. Is about security. So a lot of times ethics boards will ask you about security, and they don't. It's changed. First of all, the field's changing so quickly. But then I'll hear things like, "What about the cloud? Can we put stuff in the cloud?" And I'm a computer programmer. The cloud to me is just some other server somewhere. But they don't. The lack of sort of differentiation between each of those scenarios is very important. And security is absolutely important, but I mean, right now, what security level is appropriate? Like, is it something that the NSA can't, hack into, or is it something that is reasonable for the kind of resourcing that we have? And so those are the kinds of issues that also, are important to consider in this.
Yeah, I would really like to connect to that with two smaller thoughts about this reasonability standard. I think that's really a subject to discussion, because it really leads any kind of data protection and is often considered as some kind of objective standard, which is definitely not. And so the question is how you really involve more the subjects those are affected by working with their brain data also, and are affected in their neurorights into this interpretation of reasonability, of course. And the second is the notion and issue and term of security, which I think should always correspond to the legal and ethical decisions we make. And so this could be, stepping stone for more interdisciplinary discourse. And I will definitely let Philipp have the last word, of course.
Well, the last word would be to again thank you so much for taking time for this excellent conversation, for elucidating these complex topics, and I hope to continue the conversation in other contexts. Also give our regards and our thanks to INCF as an organization and INS, International Neuroethics Society, for this dual event. We hope it won't be the last collaboration. Look forward to further engagements. So thanks a lot and enjoy the rest of your INCF meeting. Bye.